Thank you for coming, everyone. So I do have about 30 minutes of content, and we just passed 2:10, so we're going to go through this. I want to start our story in January of 2014. And it's kind of hard to remember, but there was a time when virtual reality was not the living hype machine that it is today. And this was the Global Game Jam. We had our Oculus Rift DK1 headsets, and a lot of people just hadn't seen them before. So we indulged their curiosity, and we let them try the roller coaster demo. And it was great. People had their jaws dropped, they were having a good time. But the number of developers vastly outweighed the number of headsets we had. And so pretty soon, there was a scene where a whole group of people were watching one person have a good time in VR. And we thought, this is ridiculous. Let's come up with a game where all of those people who are interested but otherwise removed from it could be playing the same game. Let's take the fact that they see something different than the person in VR and turn that into a game. And so we came up with the scenario of defusing a bomb. The person in virtual reality has a bomb they have to defuse. Everyone outside of virtual reality has the answers on how to do it. And that game would be called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. And we'll just get some blood pumping, so I'm going to ask for some audience participation. Who has heard of this game before coming to the session? Okay, that's horrifying. That's everybody. Who has actually played the game? That is still a lot of you. Okay, awesome. So that's how indies do analytics. Thank you for participating. And before I go any further, I should explain who the team is. So on the left is Brian Fetter. In the middle, Alan Pestalozzi. And on the right, the guy who looks like a younger version of me is me. I'm Ben Kane. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our other two key contributors. Liam Sauvé did all of our music, and Chris Taylor did all of our artwork. But for the most part, this talk is going to be about design. And so that's the three of us here. So we made our prototype at the Global Game Jam. But we also made a video of the very first people playing it. And we put it on YouTube the very next day, and it got a lot of traction. It got picked up by a bunch of sites, and eventually it got a couple 100,000 views. And so we did what any reasonable group of people who had never worked on anything together before would do. Alan quit his job, and we devoted the next 2 years of our lives to working on this game. And so to bring you up to present, we actually released the game on Gear VR last June. More recently, just a couple months ago, we released our PC version, followed shortly by Mac. And we've never actually revealed any sales numbers publicly, but now that we're on a bunch of different platforms and a bunch of different stores, I'm happy to say that in total, aggregate, very vague data, we've sold more than 200,000 copies. So for a really small team, thank you. For a really small team, kind of taking a gamble on VR, maybe a couple years too early, we're really happy with this. Now, if you're not super familiar with the game, maybe you're watching at home, this is what the game looks like today. This is what the diffuser sees. It's a procedurally generated time bomb. It's got puzzles on it. The puzzles have different colors of wires and different button labels, things like that. And they need to defuse this thing, but they don't know how. For that, you turn to the experts. And the experts have a manual, and the manual tells you how to defuse every bomb imaginable. And if you want the manual, you can get it from bombmanual.com. It's just a web page. You can bring it up on any device that can browse the internet. You can print it out, that sort of thing. And the whole crux of the game is that each side has information that the collective needs. So everyone needs to talk it out to try to figure out the solutions before the bomb explodes. And so that's the asymmetry. You have two different roles. You have the diffuser on one side and the expert on the other. But you also have some asymmetry in terms of format. One person's playing a traditional video game. The other person might just be reading from a binder. And that makes things really, really flexible. You can play locally as long as you're not looking at each other's screens. But as long as you can talk to whoever you're playing with, it works too. So a lot of people play over Skype or TeamSpeak. Now, what are we going to talk about today? Well, the first thing I want to cover is what we did to discover our game. And then the bulk of the talk will be our big focus on all of our design decisions. So I want to give you some concrete examples of not only what we did, but what we tried to avoid doing. And we'll start with discovering the game. And discover is a deliberate choice of words here, because I feel we learned what our game would be just as much as we tried to push it to be something in particular. And we discovered our game by showing it at conferences for a little more than a year straight. And that just kind of felt like the logical thing to do, because we had shown our game immediately after the game jam. The cat was out of the bag. And we were going to do a VR game, and nobody owned VR headsets. So the only way we were going to get some feedback is if we took it to the road and actually put these things on people's faces. So demoing was going to be this ongoing process all throughout development. And it wouldn't just be that we'd spend a lot of our time marketing. Demoing was going to fundamentally shape what our game would be. And I think the big reason we were able to do this is because we didn't run our demos like an arcade. This wasn't something where you just came up and played the game and then left. We wanted it to be a memorable experience for the people who played our game, but also a useful tool for us. And to do that, we had a really structured routine. Now, part of this was born of necessity because we were doing VR. And with VR, you have to clean the headset, you have to put it on people's heads and adjust the straps. It's a whole to-do, frankly. But even if we weren't doing VR in the future, I would still use this sort of process. And this is how it worked. When a couple of players came up to play our game, we would hand them a postcard. And this postcard would have everything that we wished they wanted to know about our game. So things like the name of our game and where to follow us on Twitter. But on the other side was information that they filled out themselves. So as we explained the roles of the game to them, they would write their name down as diffuser and their names down as experts. Then they'd tick a couple boxes as they learned what kind of game mode they'd be playing. Then, as they started playing their game, the expert would start scribbling down all these arcane symbols and anything the diffuser was yelling at them. They'd be trying to sketch pictures of the bomb, just creating their story. And at the end of it, we would very ceremoniously give them a big stamp for exploded or diffused. And it would look something kind of like this. And it was a souvenir that they had personalized. It was something they wanted to keep. And if they had had a really stressful time playing our game, which is kind of common for the first time you're playing, they might not remember everything, but now they have this evidence that they can use to tell a story to their friends. And so our process of doing this kept things really structured, and it kept us involved and close with the people playing the game. We got all of their feedback, and more importantly, we got to observe them while they were playing. Our game involves talking, so our job involved eavesdropping. And we learned a lot of things from this, but one of the most important ones was who was actually playing our game. Because when we first came up with the idea, it was a virtual reality type of thing. And we thought early adopters are going to want to play this. And it's true, people who were really into VR seemed to like our game. But then we noticed that kids really liked our game. And they liked playing the expert side just as much as the VR side. And strangely, they liked playing with their parents because they could boss their parents around. And then the parents liked playing with their kids because their kids were actually talking to them. But most surprising were the number of people who readily identified themselves as not being into video games. Because they would have their friends convince them to play our game just by saying, here, like, take this manual, help me out, help me defuse a bomb. That was a thin end of the wedge, and you could convince people who weren't into playing video games to at least give it a shot. And so this sort of wide appeal, and then recognizing that people are having fun just communicating with each other, led us to kind of a surprising conclusion. We're not making a bomb game at all. We're actually making a communication party game. It just happens to be bomb-themed. And that had a few consequences. It meant we weren't going to include anything grim or dark or realistic. We weren't going to have any imagery of explosives in our game. There would be no mention of a bomber. There's never anybody at risk. Even the manual has really careful diction. It's written from the voice of the good guys. And at worst, it talks about exploding. It's never injury or death. And so this sort of thing was our process all throughout development. We would exhibit the game at a conference, we would make changes based on what people told us, but also what we had listened in on, and then we tried out at the next one. And I'm not going to lie, this takes a tremendous amount of overhead to do, but everything else I'm going to talk about today was shaped by these playtests. Now initially, we didn't have a lot to show. We had a game jam prototype, and once the novelty of that kind of wore off, we were left asking ourselves, what are we actually making? Because we didn't have a design document, we didn't have a schedule, and more importantly, we didn't know what a finished game was actually going to look like. And it can be tough to nail down what your game is going to be about, and for us it was kind of doubly so because we had these two pretty different roles that players could take on. But we needed to focus because otherwise things would become diverged and muddled. We needed a single guiding principle that we could hold any decision up to, regardless of which role it was for. And so we decided to focus on what we wanted our players to experience. And our breakthrough was when we came across this one clear goal. And it was to foster interesting communication. So yes, there are two roles, but they're in service of one game. We're not trying to make a great bomb defusing game and then a great manual reading simulator. And that's because the fun really lives between players. Interesting communication is where players make mistakes. It's where they get flustered. It's where they trip on their words. But it's also where they're empowered to become a more efficient team and to start taking verbal shortcuts. Interesting communication is where all the jokes happen. It's where your friendships and relationships get tested. It's where the satisfaction of victory is earned. Interesting communication is where these stories really come from. So that was our clear direction. But how do you actually foster interesting communication? Well, the most obvious thing is it starts with balance. If you're going to have interesting communication, you need some communication. So we needed to make sure that the diffusers and the experts had different pieces of information, and it was integral that they communicated back and forth. So let's start with the expert side and the manual. Now, a lot of you have played the game, but if you haven't, the way the manual basically works is that based on the state of the bomb, the expert needs to isolate a solution. So a manual page will have solutions that cover every possible combination that a bomb can exist in. But you need to figure out which one actually applies to the given bomb. And this can be fairly simple. It can be something like, if there is exactly one red wire, cut the first wire. If that applies to your bomb, you've found the solution, you're done. If it doesn't, you're going to have to keep looking. And if you haven't seen the manual before, a couple pages look like this. It's not important that you're able to read this. It's just that you get a sense that it can be a lot of text, it can be strange diagrams, it can be weird tables, and it's completely static. It covers all possible scenarios and hopefully is dense enough with information that's not easy to memorize. The key here is that the manual is the game logic. It just happens to be deliberately obtuse. And we make it obtuse to try to hinder communication. We want people talking, but we want to trip them up just a little bit. And so if you look at our manual pages, our intent is usually pretty obvious on each of them. Sometimes it's really dense text. Other times it's trying to interpret a 4-set Venn diagram really quickly. Sometimes we'll have multiple stages, and later stages will reference things that you did in earlier stages, and we'll see how good your short-term memory is. So those are some of the things we do on the manual side. But now let's talk about the expert, the video game side. And for that, we asked ourselves, what are players bad at talking about? And initially, they're bad at talking about everything, because you get inundated with visual information the first time you play your game. You have no idea what is important, what's significant, and so new players tend to keep talking really literally, and they just spew this deluge of one-way information at their experts, and they quickly realize that that's a poor way to communicate. Then we found out that people are really bad with unfamiliar symbols. So if you or your expert haven't seen Cyrillic script before, you might not be able to describe this quickly and concisely in an unambiguous way. Incidentally, if you are familiar with Cyrillic script, this is really trivial, and we found that out after we launched. But at the highest level, multitasking is what really keeps things challenging. Diffusers will eventually need to solve multiple puzzles at once just to get everything done on time. And if you start to play with a group of experts instead of just one, then the overhead of delegating tasks really becomes key. Now, on top of this, we get to add stress. And this is where it's fun. Because stress is where people make mistakes. It's where they forget things. And the best part is, it's completely their fault. Now, we get some of this for free because the scenario is trying to defuse a bomb with a ticking clock, and it's beeping constantly. But we also like to just twist the knife a little bit. So when the timer goes below 1 minute, we start displaying milliseconds. It's not actually going faster, but psychologically, people start to panic just a little bit. And then during the middle of conversation, that's not as loud as I hoped. That was an alarm clock. We can set an alarm clock off on you. We can also do things like turning out the lights and other distractions in the game. And if you played the game, these might seem totally random, but they're actually not. Under the hood, we have a little pacing system. And the way it works is every so often, the game will calculate a rough score for how you're doing. So we'll take into consideration how many puzzles have you solved, how many more do you have left, how much time do you have left, and have you made any mistakes? And the goal here is to figure out, is this player bound for failure or not? And if they're doing well, then we're going to trip you up. We'll turn an alarm clock on. We'll shut off the lights, things like that. But if you're not doing well, if you're already going to lose, we're not going to kick you when you're down. And this isn't just us being merciful. It actually helps encourage those last-second saves. We don't want to accelerate a death spiral. We want people to get those really exciting defuse the bomb with 2 seconds left. That can be difficult to orchestrate artificially, but we can nudge it in the right direction with systems like these. And the last piece of the stress puzzle is the music. Because the bombs in Keep Talking aren't all of a fixed timer length, and so it wouldn't make sense to have fixed music tracks either. And so what we did was create 30-second loops of increasing intensity. And as the timer runs down, we transition into the more appropriate intensity. And you might not notice the music building up on you, but by the time you hit that 30-second mark, we kick in with what we call internally the death bell. And when that starts tolling, it can make those last 30 seconds feel more like 10. These are all things we do to try to foster communication, to try to foster interesting communication, to try to trip people up, get them saying the wrong thing. But I think it's valuable to look at what can hinder interesting communication too. And is there anything we can do to avoid that? So what do I mean by this? Well, in general, if people are talking between rounds or they're talking about your game, so they're having some sort of meta conversation, we would ideally like it to be about their communication strategy. We want them working on that, developing shorthand, coming up with better ways of solving puzzles and delegating tasks. That sort of stuff is interesting. Then they're still focused on playing our game. What we don't want is them focused on the designer intent. We don't want them trying to figure out what does the game want from us. And you certainly don't want them thinking, this is unfair. Any failure that a team experiences has to be a result of their own mistake. And more importantly, they have to agree that it was their own fault. You want them feeling that they're in this together against a bomb and not against us, the game designers. And this is a noble goal, but it's kind of tricky to pull off. So here are a few things that we did to make that happen. And we'll think about the roles for a second here. There's the expert reading the manual and a diffuser playing a video game. And the manual is some text, it's kind of dull. But the video games are what we're good at. We could add lots of cool stuff here. This is our wheelhouse. We could do timing and dexterity challenges. We could have all sorts of complex inputs. But if you think about it, despite the name, we haven't really asked much of the experts. They need to be able to read, and they need to be able to communicate. That's it. And we want this game to appeal to a wide audience. But more importantly, we want to make sure that the game is really between those two roles, not on any one side. And so this was an area where we felt some balance, or some symmetry, if you will, was actually appropriate, at least as far as the difficulty and approachability was concerned. Because imagine the scenario where, as a team, you successfully identify what to do, and you tell your diffuser to do something, and then they're not skilled or experienced enough to actually pull it off. That's no fun for anybody. We don't want you to feel you have to practice cutting wires just to be good at our game. And so we went with a simple interaction model. We require specific and deliberate inputs, and it's the decision-making that's really the hard part. The actual input is a matter of selecting the right thing and just pushing a single button. And this helps ensure that the conversation doesn't stray from team thinking, which is what we want, and devolve into blaming a player for their poor execution. All right, the next area concerns both the expert and the diffuser. And this is the rules. The rules themselves need to be totally unambiguous. They have to be beyond reproach. Players can't be doubting them. No rule should ever be based on chance, and no rule should ever have the ambiguity that forces players to guess. Because if they're forced to guess, or if they feel forced to guess, then one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to be wrong and feel cheated, which is understandable, or they're going to be right and feel completely unsatisfied, which honestly is just as bad. And this might seem simple enough, but when you're working on a game, you get so close to it that it can be hard to see these scenarios come up. Now, we're not going to make a rule that has a 50-50 chance in it, but it can sneak in other ways. And to show you what I mean, we'll look at the serial number. And if you played the game, every bomb has a serial number. It's just a string of characters. They can be letters or digits. And various rules can ask you things about the serial number. So it might be, cut the first wire if the serial number contains a vowel. Well, here we have the letter Y. And in English, that can be a vowel sometimes. That's not good. This one, pretty easy to see, even in advance. So we took Y out of the game, at least as far as serial numbers go. Other things don't show up until you actually implement them. So here, our font choice for a capital O could be pretty ambiguous with a 0, at least if you don't have a 0 side by side. So this was another case where once we saw it, we had to remove capital O from all serial numbers. And it keeps going like this. Our serial numbers end in digits so that we can ask questions like, is the last digit of the serial number even? But here we have a case where it ends in a 0. And players are quick to tell us, well, sometimes 0 is even, sometimes it's odd. That is never true. It is always even. So this is one case where we put our foot down, and if you didn't know that, we'll teach you something. We're okay with that. But these things continue to pop up months and months after we thought we'd be finished with them. Here's a really simple puzzle where the answer is cut the second wire. And for hundreds of playtests, no problem, totally fine. Then one weekend, a group of players asked amongst themselves, does that mean from the top or from the bottom? We thought, that's strange, no one's ever asked that before. But at that same conference, 2 more groups of players had the same conversation. And we realized that we had made an assumption without really intending to. And so we needed to flesh out our instructions just to clarify this. And the worst part is, or the best part, none of these groups actually told us this. They never reported it as a problem. It was only because we were eavesdropping on them that we actually caught this. Okay, the last big thing I want to talk about is enabling player trust. Because ours is a game about learning the rules, and mistakes are going to happen. People are going to explode. It's expected. It's part of the game. But how can we ensure that when players do make mistakes, their conversation doesn't devolve into, I think I found a bug, because I'm right and the game must be wrong? Well, we figured the best thing for us to do was to have our own confidence in the rules. And that way we could push back on players and say that, no, it's actually working properly. And when we first did our Game Jam version, the manual was actually just a Google Doc, and we wrote it up while looking at code in the other window. We also did it at about 3 a.m., so there's an error in it. And that's the kind of thing that we couldn't have in a real game. That doesn't scale to working on a game for a year or 2. We needed to make sure that the manual and the game, stayed in sync. And so this is kind of the secret sauce behind Keep Talking. This is something we don't talk about very much, but I'll share it with you now. The rules of Keep Talking are also procedurally generated, much like the bombs. So every time the game runs, we generate rule data, and that's actually what the game executes, that rule data. The manual, in turn, is also procedurally generated from an exported version of that rule data. And that might be a little hard to wrap your head around, so I'll give you kind of a high-level example of how this can work, at least for our simple wire puzzle. So rules are made up of a bunch of different pieces. The first one is what we call a property. And a property is just a fact about the state of the bomb or a particular puzzle. It evaluates to true or false, and it will always be true or false for that given bomb. And these can be really simple things like, there's exactly 1 red wire. You can ask a question, is there exactly 1 red wire, and get a true or false answer back. The next piece is what we call a solution. And a solution is just a unique index that's expected. You remember earlier I told you that our interaction model was really simple, and it was a case of picking which wire you want or picking which button to press. We can compare the index of whatever the player did against what the rule expects. And if they match, they've done something correctly. And these, again, can be quite simple. Something like cut the first wire. This is the English representation on the manual for index 0 on the code side. And this is a really simple but kind of powerful concept, because we can make really expressive things like press the button with the same label as the button you pushed in stage 2. As long as it boils down to 1 unique index, we can do this sort of stuff. And now if you combine properties, which you can ask questions about, and solutions as a consequence, you get what we call a rule. And these 2 simple things combine, and you can get stuff like, if there's more than 1 black wire and the serial number contains a vowel, cut the first black wire. And now we have a rule that covers some of the possibility space for all the bombs that can be generated. And if you did enough of these rules, you could cover the entire possibility space. And that's how Keep Talking works. So you make a bunch of rules, you make sure that they're organized in a list and executed in some sort of determined order, and you can cover all possible bomb states. And you might be thinking, well, that's going to be an awful lot of rules, and you'd be right, which is why we have an otherwise case to keep things reasonable. And if you spread out the distribution of where bombs are going to fall, you can keep this pretty entertaining. Now, the eagle eye among you might be saying, wait, I thought you said the manual was static. What's this about generating stuff? Well, the manual is static now. All the rules in Keep Talking right now are static. We go through the trouble of generating them every time. We just use seed 0 every single time the game is run. But during development, this was really important because our rules were changing, game logic was churning, and whenever we took the game to a conference, we needed to know that the rules that the game were running were the same rules that the manual was written with. So this was really important while we were working on it. It's also kind of a future-proofing thing. People have really surprised us with how capable they are at memorizing things, and so in the future, we might need variations on our manual and things like that. And since we've been generating them from the start, this is something that we can do in the future. So the takeaway here is that there's more to the manual than you might have thought. It wasn't a trivial part of development, and that kind of makes sense because it represents half the game. You have one diffuser and one or more experts. And that's actually the last bit that I'm going to cover here. So let me just recap what we were talking about. Demoing was what allowed us to figure out who the game was for and where the fun really lived. And I think the way that we demoed it was a big factor in that. The next big piece was focusing on our desired player experience. So this idea of fostering interesting communication, that meant we had one rule that we could hold any design decision up to, whether it was a diffuser or expert, and we could know that we were in service of one common goal. Now, we're still working on the game. We're bringing it to more platforms, but there's other things we're looking at too. Things continue to surprise us. The wide audience that we saw is actually a lot wider than we thought. People are using this in corporate team building. They're using it in interviews, which is a little scary. And it's also making its way into schools. Admittedly, not so much in North America, but there are a lot of educators that are interested in this sort of thing. And the other piece of the puzzle is the competitive nature of the game. It is a cooperative game, but people seem to like teaming up and competing against each other. And we could definitely support that in better ways. In other words, we continue to discover what our game is and what people want it to be. And we're going to continue working towards that. So that's everything I have to say. If anybody wants to learn more about the game, you can find it at keeptalkinggame.com. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Ben Kane. I don't think we have too much time for questions here, so we're just going to go to the wrap-up room immediately. And you can follow me there. Tell me what your least favorite puzzle is and why it's Morse code. Thank you.